You know, after the 2005 Jyllands-Posten's cartoon by the Conservative magazine in paper in Denmark, the only paper really in Europe that was still willing to draw pictures of Muhammad in the same way they're willing to draw pictures of any other religious, political, you name it, figure, was Charlie Hebdo. So Charlie Hebdo stood out alone. Charlie Hebdo was attacked. That's why I've suggested that there's really only two options that the press in particular can go on from here. The first is that we all agree that we live under an element of Islamic blasphemy law. I think that would be highly regrettable. I don't think that is what our society should live under. I think we should do everything possible to avoid it. But if we are going to avoid it, I think that it's going to have to be done unanimously. All of the newspapers, all of the magazines, the BBC, Sky, Channel 4, should unanimously publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons.
By Douglas Murray from the Henry Jackson Society and by Maajid Nawaz from the counter-extremism think tank, the Quilliam Foundation. Now, he received death threats for tweeting a cartoon of Muhammad and Jesus last year. Douglas Murray, is this a new kind of terrorism that we're facing now, in the sense that these people were clearly highly professional? It looks pretty certain that they were trained on foreign battlefields and that they're operating in small units that doesn't involve the massive kind of planning that 9/11 involved.
It's new in that way, as you say, the highly trained killers. It's not new in other ways. We've had for more than a decade now attacks on people who have asserted their right to free speech in Europe, attacks on the cartoonists in Denmark. In 2010, one of the Danish cartoonists had an axeman trained by Al-Shabaab who came into his house and tried to decapitate him. There have been, of course, the murder of Theo van Gogh and many, many other assaults. I'm afraid it's a very long list now. It's a long list, but it may be getting even more fatal, in that the people yesterday clearly knew what they were doing in a very professional way. They're homegrown. They're French citizens. It looks, as far as we know, that they were born in France. They spoke French without foreign accents. And it also looks like they were trained by foreign jihadists.
It does indeed. And what these people are seeking to provoke in Europe, across Europe, is a form of civil war between Muslims and non-Muslims. They seek to divide our communities, which makes it even more important for us not just to stand united, but actually to do something else, to go a step further. And that is to fill the vacuum in the middle of what I call the aggressively liberal centre ground. Liberal with a small L. That means everyone gets involved and reasserts the way in which we cherish our principles of freedom of speech and human rights. If we don't do that, that vacuum will be filled by both neo-Nazis on the one end, who we've seen are already attacking certain kebab shops and mosques in France, and Islamist extremists on the other. And that vacuum it has been left alone in that way to be filled by the two extremes, because liberals haven't been speaking out enough to challenge Islamist extremism, to challenge the way in which we've been eroding our values, and everything that the Islamists have wanted to achieve and the way they're dividing communities, they've been getting away with so far. You know, this is a tactical assault on the magazine. The strategy that sits above that tactic is something else entirely. It's not just about the magazine here, though of course they've targeted something because of the cartoons.
Can I just pick up on that very quickly? I agree very much with the majority of Maajid's sentiment. I mean, I think this has always been a risk. It's a risk because mainstream politicians in France, Britain, elsewhere have ignored a lot of this problem. You know, before Christmas, the attacks, people shouting Allahu Akbar and driving cars into people. The French president said, this is lone acts of madmen. Everyone else can see what this is. It isn't simple attacks of lunacy. But the one thing, if I may say, I slightly disagree with Maajid on, it's true that is a great risk. That this centre ground is losing its confidence. However, I think we shouldn't attribute motives to the gunmen. They haven't expressed. I think it's very clear at the moment. The gunmen did not go in order to divide us. They went in to assert Islamic blasphemy laws in a European city on 12 people in the office
and
of a European magazine. Yes, but it is to enforce a particular idea of blasphemy law.
Well, I want to come on to the politics in a minute, but let's look first of all at the security implications, because the security forces in this country are very worried that this could easily happen in this country. Indeed, some are surprised that it hasn't already. There is now huge pressure on the security forces to deal with a new and evolving form of terrorism that is harder and harder to capture, because if you're not putting much advanced planning into something, there's not much chatter to listen to, there's not much you can detect. until it happens.
Well, you always have this arms race between terrorists and security forces. They always come up with a new method. If we make a target hard, they'll move to a soft target. They'll find a new way of getting around it. So there's never a complete answer. But it was interesting, after 7/7, we feared there'd be a series of copycat attacks. We feared there'd be a whole range of these attacks. In fact, they didn't happen in the end. They didn't happen partly because the security services were very effective at stopping them, and partly because there wasn't the motivation for it.
But they did happen, didn't they? I mean, the 21st of July 2005, there were 4 people who went on with bombs to the London Underground to do another 4 suicide attacks.
Yep.
Unfortunately, from their point of view, their bombs didn't work perfectly, but there were certainly copycat attacks. That was an attempt to replay the 7/7 bombings a fortnight after the bombings.
Exactly, I remember it very well. And we spent a long period in a fog of war trying to chase after them and find where they went. So there was an immediate copycat. What we feared was this was going to be a new pattern, that you'd have more and more of these attacks.
Sure.
As I say, the reason they haven't happened is partly the success of the security services in their prosecutions, partly because there wasn't the motivation for that to happen. And I hope that will be the case here, but it may not.
But we are in a situation now where these terrorists, the ones in France, and indeed the ones in Britain that beheaded Private Rigby, are homegrown. They've grown up in the countries that they're now attacking. They have the ability now to go abroad and be trained in Syria or Iraq or in the Yemen in the latest and most efficient forms of terrorist activity, and then very quietly come back. Not quite lone wolves necessarily, but very small cells that have no elaborate infrastructure. And that is a new challenge for the security services.
It is indeed. If you're going to have a lone wolf with some training coming and doing things, there isn't the chance you can't trace them. It's true. As I say, there's an arms race. So the police and the security service will have to find new ways of trying to deal with them.
Do we spend enough on our security and intelligence services?
Yes, we increased enormously the amount we spent on the security services.
But is it
after
enough
7/7.
as the threat
Well,
grows?
there's never enough. You have to make balances between what you spend on one thing and on another. But yes, I think we do spend a great deal on counter-terrorism.
Do the security services and the intelligence services have enough powers?
Yes, I mean, I think there is always going to be a tension between those who want to ensure our liberal state, that we don't have ourselves, find ourselves monitored the whole time, and those who want to make sure that security is tight. I would be with those who want to have tighter security when possible.
In a sense, the terrorists are winning, aren't they? They've cowed the Western media into not repeating the cartoons.
Not only are they winning, they've won. They've won. Terrorism works. That's the brutal fact of it. Terrorism works. And a lot of people will take lessons from that today. You know, after the 2005 Jyllands-Posten's cartoon by the conservative magazine in paper in Denmark, the only paper really in Europe that was still willing to draw pictures of Muhammad in the same way they're willing to draw pictures of any other religious, political, you name it, figure, was Charlie Hebdo. So Charlie Hebdo stood out alone. Charlie Hebdo was attacked. That's why I've suggested that there's really only 2 options that the press in particular can go on from here. The first is that we all agree that we live under an element of Islamic blasphemy law. I think that would be highly regrettable. I don't think that is what our society should live under. I think we should do everything possible to avoid it. But if we are going to avoid it, I think that it's going to have to be done unanimously. All of the newspapers, all of the magazines, the BBC, Sky, Channel 4, should unanimously publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons at a particular hour, because as Ayaan Hirsi Ali said after the Danish cartoons row, we have to spread the risk around. It cannot be that a single cartoonist is holding the line for all freedom of speech, or that a single small satirical magazine is doing it. It has to be everybody.
I must say, I don't agree that terrorism works. I mean, Jim Pryor, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, said the other day that terrorism works. Terrorism works in terms of getting attention. Terrorism works in terms of dividing, or it can work in terms of dividing.
Well, it's
but it
worth
doesn't
it no
work.
British newspaper has repeated these cartoons.
They're cowed, aren't they?
Yeah,
I hope they're not.
Well, I think.
But they have been.
Well, I think. Well, having gone through this myself last year, I think people have been cowed, and I think not only have people been cowed, it's highly regrettable that, in some instances, the very people that led the charge to have me deselected as a Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate for saying I wasn't offended, merely not being offended at a cartoon, have been re-invited back onto the BBC as moderate spokespeople, claiming that somehow this is an issue of freedom of speech and that they are not offended. And these are the same people only a year ago that led a lynch mob. So we have surrendered over many years to this constant fear of offending Muslim communities. Well, actually, there are Muslims within Muslim communities who are dissenting voices, who are liberals,
You can
who are
understand
attempting
why,
to
though,
break
can't
those
you, if
taboos.
this sort of thing happens?
Can I
Of course, but no, we have to. Where does this end? What I'm arguing is that there has to be a European-wide civil society-led response. There has to be a European-wide government response. And this idea of, I was arguing the same in another interview. This idea, I called it a reverse cartel. The editors need to get together, and they do need to share the risk, and they need to say enough is enough. Satire plays an important role in democratic societies, and freedom of speech an even more important role. And what is that role? And we have to understand why it's so important. We cannot devise policy or law without the right to speak, and it's as simple as that.
But you were on Sky News earlier this morning with not a jihadist, but certainly a Muslim activist.
Yeah.
Quite an interesting interview there, discussion in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo, attacks back in France. And I agree obviously with everything that was said, except for I would take a little bit, a different take on the fact of whether terrorism works or not. In the short term, after a terrorist attack, after a violent attack, after anything that takes the lives of humans that have not done a single thing wrong at all, innocent humans, innocent civilians that get caught up in the terroristic acts of these fundamentalist extremists. In the short term, does it cause terror? Yes. Does it cause fear? Yes. Does it cause anger? Yes. Does it cause resolve? Absolutely. And I think in the aftermath of these attacks, when things begin to settle down and life begins to get back to somewhat normal, then things, as I said, you just go back to your normal lives. That's what human beings do. It may be stuck in the back of your minds or whatever, but we're still going about our business. So in that sense, I don't think terrorism wins in the long term. Now, security-wise, the gentleman from 10 Downing Street, in charge of security, basically saying the same thing, that he doesn't feel terrorism, it doesn't win out completely. And to say that terrorism wins right away, I think in a sort of sense is, giving up a little bit of our precious freedoms, slowly but surely, to the terroristic element. And I don't think anybody, really wants to do that. And as far as spreading the risk around, that's what everybody out there that decides that they want to capture this freedom of speech, freedom of choice to do whatever you want, to be able to publish, to write, to express your views, your values, your opinions, without the threat of repercussion, without the threat of violence, without the threat of a terrorist incident, of violent incidents happening in just a nirvana type world. That was what we would all hope for. But we don't live in that type of a world. We live in a much completely different world where people, they just get ticked off, pissed off for just anything. And that they think that they can put their values, their cultures above another value, above another culture, when they're not even the predominant value, the predominant culture, predominant religion in a certain area of society or a certain geographical boundary or in a country. So that instead of adhering to the laws of that country, living within those laws, no, to try to impose their will, their fundamentalism, their extremism, their culture, their values onto a country that receives some of them in the beginning in small numbers and now increasingly large numbers. And it's just a small faction, people, that's doing this. But it doesn't take a lot, just like the gentleman was saying too, from 10 Downing Street, a lone wolf. The moderator basically saying that these people have gone, they're French citizens, they are British citizens, and they have the passports, they freely travel to parts of Syria, to parts of Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, to other parts of the Middle East to get training. And then they come back. And they're radicalized from when they leave here. They become even more radicalized when they come back. And they decide, maybe just one or a few, to perpetrate some type of a terrorists act upon the civilian population. And so like they're saying is that if there's not a huge amount of cells, if there's not a lot of chatter going across, the airwaves, over the internet, if it's just a small little cell, just a collective cell, just a couple of individuals, it doesn't take a lot to wreak havoc upon a population and destruction as well. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I've been your host, Dr. Nasir. If you liked our content, please, we'd love you to subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. You all know what to do. Take a look at our other video links above and below. I'll leave you with my final thought, which is, when you're right, you're right. And when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.